Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. Um, Let me just start by saying that obviously COVID has been a disaster on many fronts for the economy, but in particular for the social sector. And quite frankly, I think we all need to think about how in the future we can build more resilience in the sector, but also advocate for the sector so that this sector is treated like a priority sector, because it clearly hasn't been, in these COVID times. So it's hard to quantify the impact on the sector, but I think from all reports, it seems to me that there is probably a 20-25% impact on budgets, in the sector. If we just look at CSR spending, which hasn't reduced too much in the year, but just the diversion towards COVID, between PM Care and other measures, uh, that's one big impact. And then, of course, other sources of retail funding and HNIs and foreign funding, etc. So at a minimum, I think there is a fairly significant impact in terms of money. And that clearly has an impact in terms of resources and livelihoods in the sector. I know one figure that I've seen is employment of 7 million in the sector. I don't know how to validate that. So I think to start with, we need to, even before we talk about the future work, I think we need to quantify the work being done by the sector, the good work being done by the sector. In fact, the role played by the sector, even during this pandemic, where I think it's because of the partnership of civil society with government that we were able to ensure that people got food, they were not hungry, that violence was prevented and order was maintained, in the country, and we were able to react quickly. As I think about this sort of going forward, obviously we hope there's never a pandemic like this, but we do need to look at not only the trends around the future of work, which, there are some trends in terms of work from anywhere, work from home, which will play a role in some sectors. But in the social sector, where a lot of work is done on the ground, where a lot of work is empathy related in education, in healthcare, I still believe that humans are at the core of what needs to get delivered in the social sector. So the need for, this sector to have a large employee base will always be the case. Clearly, technology can play some role in being integrated in terms of providing tools for the people who work in healthcare, for teachers, and there are lots of innovative things that can be done post-COVID that I'll talk about in a minute. I think as far as the resilience of the sector is concerned, I think this pandemic has also shown us that we need to look at a different model. It is tragic that most NGOs operate with a cash balance of 2 months or 1 month of expenses, and that really when the inflow dries up, they are faced with an existential crisis. And I almost feel that we need to set a norm where, after 3, 4, 5 years of an organization sort of establishing itself, so the early years, like any startup, will always be high risk, and you need to scrounge and find a way to get there. But once you have proven yourself and gotten to a certain stage, which I think is the 5-year mark, you've survived. At that point, I think we almost need a norm where a typical NGO should have 9 to 12 months of cash on its balance sheet, 9 to 12 months of expenses, covered in terms of cash on the balance sheet. The only way to do that is to have a corpus. The only way to have a corpus is if we start educating donors that there is something beyond program funding. And that beyond program funding, there's obviously capacity building, but there's also this idea of having a corpus. Now, I understand that certain categories of donors like CSR, rightly so, will not want to fund a corpus. They'll want to fund programs. But then there may be other categories of donors who are willing to give unrestricted funds that could go towards some form of corpus. And I think that whilst I largely put the responsibility on the shoulders of donors, I would also encourage nonprofits to start to think about this more actively. Is what can you do? Obviously, you can't approach a donor first time and say, fund my corpus. But if you have an existing set of donors who've been loyal to the organization, who like the work, I think they are natural prospects to be folks who would want to be trustees, or trustees as in people who care about the organization and want to protect the organization from the vicissitudes of the, what could happen in the economy or with donors, etc. So one thing I think in terms of the future of NGOs is for us to build a model which is much more resilient, where we can buffer shocks. I mean, larger institutions like hospitals, universities tend to have some of these buffers, but and partly because they have revenue coming in. But for NGOs where the only revenue is donor money, I think it becomes even more critical to look at how you can have, some kind of corpus. I think also the idea of what is your core expense and what are other projects that you're running that can be turned off. I think we always do scenario planning when the crisis hits. But I think going forward, it has taught me at least that it is important for any organization to have a clear sense of what are core costs, what are absolute essentials. Maybe it's a core team, what have you. What are some core programs and what are programs that you could live without potentially? So almost figure out what your priorities are and know what you can let go of and ensure that many of those costs are variable. So because there will be downturns even going forward, and a buffer can tide you over for a period of time, but it cannot ensure that you have a flexible model to recalibrate if times were to change or if donor interests were to change, etc. In terms of the future going forward for the sector, in terms of the model beyond the financials, I think one opportunity that I see post-COVID is, or rather two opportunities that I see. One is for nonprofits to clearly look at using more technology. And it's technology in various forms. It could be internally, it could be in terms of program delivery, it could be in terms of data collection and monitoring, which could be done more in real time or differently. And so for instance, we know with nutrition, for instance, or running some of our programs, that the data reliability that comes from the last mile worker may not be that great. Now, for instance, Wadhwani AI has developed a tool, a mobile-based optical recognition tool, where through machine learning, just taking a picture of a baby, a child, can give you a measure of height and weight. So looking at these kinds of tools, I think will be very critical in terms of measuring and monitoring. But I think even in terms of the programs, they can play a role. I mean, I'll give you an example or two. We at Central Square Foundation had incubated an organization called the Teacher App. It just so happened they were already there before COVID. They had developed content courses for teachers, online blended learning courses for teachers. And what we've seen in this COVID times is 1 million+ teachers have done 5+ courses each. And I see going forward that tools like these can be embedded in. There's no reason to just have physical teacher development, but more blended teacher development. And organizations that have developed these tools will be able to really leverage them going forward. Another example is an organization like LLF, which is founded by Dheer Jingran, who's a retired IAS officer, Learning and Language Foundation. Now, they are a traditional organization in that they work with state governments, but they've also developed an online course for the middle management layer in education, for state resource groups, etc. So I think finding ways to leverage digital and embed it into the program. I don't mean to move to digital only, but I think integrating it into one's core program is going to be a key going forward. And all of us can learn from other organizations in terms of what's worked and what hasn't worked. I don't want to overpromise that technology can deliver, but I'm hopeful that we can experiment and learn and do things differently going forward. Finally, in terms of work itself, I think the nature of work will change to some extent. But as I said earlier, at the core, in terms of empathy-based professions, I think the human is still at the center of the work. I think it's so human-to-human contact, getting out in the field is going to be critical. Obviously, with technology, you can have more of a remote dispersed workforce, which I think NGOs already do have, but be able to create a one-team culture despite having a dispersed workforce, which may have been harder if you had programs in various states. You can provide people with tools so that they can have a more flexible sort of work schedule, which I think many frontline workers already have a somewhat more flexible work schedule. So I'm not sure if, frankly, work itself is going to be that different going forward. In some industries like coding, yes, people can work from anywhere. And TCS saying that someday 75% of the employees working from home or largely working from home, that's possible. But I'm not as sure about whether that model works as effectively in our sector. I mean, of course, if you're running a foundation, it's different. You can run partly in virtual mode and have much more of a flexible schedule. But if you're a ground-based organization, I think the reality may be very different, because children are still going to be going to schools post the pandemic, and people are still going to be going to primary healthcare centers, even though telemedicine may be offered in those primary healthcare centers. So I'm still a little bit skeptical about people who have taken this future of work to an extreme to say that somehow things are going to be radically different. I think the nature of work has always been changing, and we've always been using different tools, and flexibility has come into the workforce to a greater extent over a period of time. I think COVID is a disruption. It will lead to more accelerated change. But again, I'm not somebody who believes that somehow it's going to completely redefine our work. I also want to point out that it's a double-edged sword as far as women are concerned. I think in the near term, it's had a disproportionate negative impact on women, and particularly not just impacted them, their ability to work, but also potentially, faced with issues of violence and other issues in the home. But I think going forward, I think we need to look at, given how low our female participation in the workforce is. So I think for India, this is the biggest one. If 25% female participation in the workforce is abysmal. And one thing China managed to achieve is Mao always said that women hold up half the sky, and they have a higher female participation in the workforce than most developed countries. And of course, a lot of it has to do with our societal norms, and has to do with some demand side factors in terms of employers also not being friendly towards women, creating a safe environment, or whether it's transport networks in our cities. But I would say our sector, the NGO sector, has probably been much better, and frankly, is a great sector. I mean, if you look globally, women dominate this sector. And I think in India, we need to get the numbers, but I think there's a much bigger opportunity than where we are at today, in terms of women not just being in leadership positions, but also having a greater share in frontline positions. So my own view is that we need to do much more in terms of collecting data on the industry, getting a sense of where we are on many dimensions in terms of the workforce in the industry, the contribution the industry makes, along dimensions of gender, representation of low-income groups, caste, etc. To really understand the nature of our workforce. Is it representative of the beneficiaries it's trying to serve, how it's geographically diverse, what role women could be playing? And technology is one element of it. So to me, the future of work in this sector should be more around this, which is really looking at how we can build a more resilient sector to buffer shocks, how we can collect more data so we really understand the employee base and in this sector, how we can represent to the government that the sector plays an important role. And actually, in times of crisis, without this sector, the government would have been handicapped in its response. And that, for me, would be a change in this sector going forward, is that we are more vibrant, we're more resilient, we use technology, but we also are able to understand our contribution better and be able to convey it more effectively to other stakeholders.